Well, it's 11 o'clock, or it's 1 o'clock Eastern. So I think we should all get started because we have a lot to do today. So I will start by doing a quick roll call. And this is to check that people who have speaking privileges have working access to microphone. So if you can just unmute and say here when I call your name, I would appreciate it. So Connor Rosso.
Here.
Paige Bullard. James Ming Chen. H. Clayton Cook. Who I see but do not hear. Okay, we can come back to that. Christopher C. DeMuth. Jonathan Doles. Susan Dudley. Michael Fitzpatrick. H. Russell Frisbee. Alice Cotimer. Elliot P. Laws. Daniel Levinson. Erica Litzen.
Here.
Michael Livermore, who I also saw but don't hear. Also, I see Jonathan Doles, you just joined.
Yes, here. Thank you.
Charles A. Maresca.
Here.
Katia Crutiel, who's serving as the alternate for Christina McDonald.
I'm here, thank you.
Mary McLeod. David W. Ogden. Clinton Jones. Richard L. Rivez. Carrie F. Ricci.
Here.
Jonathan Rose. J.R. Schwartz. Sydney Shapiro. Catherine M. Sharkey. Ganesh Sitaraman. Peter L. Strauss. David C. Vladeck. Jonathan Weiner.
Here.
Richard E. Wiley. Chin Yu.
Here.
Marianne Zobler.
I'm here.
Great. And then we have a short list of ACUS members who are not members of this committee who still have speaking privileges. Stephanie Tatham. Peter J. Constantine. And William Funk.
Here.
Okay, is there anyone who I have not called who is an ACUS member on the committee or an ACUS member who is not on the committee or an alternate for either of those?
Yes, Clay Cook.
Great.
Jim Chen, just checking in here.
Great, I can hear both of you. Is there anyone else? Okay, I see Michael Livermore is here but having audio issues. Great, so with that, I will turn it over to Connor.
Well,
Oh,
thank you.
actually, I'm sorry, I should turn it over to Matt for opening remarks.
I have no opening remarks other than to thank everybody for joining us today. There's a lot of expertise and talent on the phone here. I can see on the Zoom call. I would especially like to thank Professors Carrigan and Shapiro for giving us an outstanding report to work with. I, for my part, enjoyed reading it very much and learned a lot from it. I think, Stuart, you, I don't know if this is your third time as a consultant, maybe it's four, something like that, and we're always happy to have you. And then finally, thank you, Connor, for the work you've devoted to this project and the many hours you will probably devote to this project before our plenary session. We're very privileged and grateful to have you as our committee chair, and you always do an outstanding job, and I'm sure you'll do an outstanding job on this project as well. So with that, let me turn it over to Connor to begin the discussion and deliberations.
Oh, thank you, Matt. And I want to echo the thanks to our consultants and to Leanne for their hard work on the project. Just before we go into the ground rules, I just want to briefly emphasize two quick overarching points. One is in formulating this recommendation, we are guided heavily by the project description that the ACUS Council approved when approving this project. And so I'll just briefly read this. The project addresses when, I'll just paraphrase, and how before issuing NPRMs, agencies should solicit public input for alternatives and identify targeted measures such as, and it gives examples. So we're really focused on how agencies should solicit public input in the pre-NPRM stage. So we've gotten some helpful comments about Circular A4 and some other issues, but we're really focused on agencies and feedback before they issue proposed rules. And that is something that the Council of ACUS has given us a task. And so that's where the project will lay, and that's where our consultant report focuses on. Secondly, again, I thank the consultants for an excellent report. I am sure that they'd be open to feedback on the report, but our task today is to debate the draft preamble and recommendation. If you have, feedback on the report as it relates to the recommendation or the preamble, great. But we don't want to go down the road of debating the report itself. I'm sure our consultants would be happy to engage with anybody about the report offline. So with that, the plan is for today is that we will have our consultants do a presentation on their research on the report. Then we'll do about 20 to 30 minutes maybe of general comments if folks have them. And then we will start working through the recommendation first. I think on this one, it makes sense to do the first and then do the preamble second. So we'll start working that. We'll try to work a break in at about an hour and a half, a little before. Leanne, feel free to remind me. And as we're debating, we are going to give priority for the first until we work through everything to ACUS members. So the members of the committee and other ACUS members who are participating. And then if we have time at the end, we will hear comments on the entire thing from non-ACUS members. The chat feature, since we're in this online format, is very important. Please use the chat feature to ask to be recognized to speak, and I will do that. And this is for the members. Please use the chat feature. I won't be able to see everybody. We have 30-something people. I can't see everybody on the small little boxes, as well as see the red line that Leanne will be doing on the screen. So please use the chat feature. But by the same token, please don't use the chat feature for substantive discussion, or we're going to have two parallel. I've had this happen. It turns into a kind of a mess. Please don't use the chat feature for substantive discussion that's going on one side while people are talking. On the other, it will distract us and will make the discussion less fruitful. So please just use the chat feature for process to be recognized to speak. So I'm sorry to be long-winded, but I will briefly read the rules for proceeding, and I will turn it over to our consultants. As I said, the ACUS members have full speaking privileges and can unmute themselves. That said, please keep your microphone on mute when you're not speaking so we don't get background noise. Please request to be recognized via chat, and I will recognize you. Please try. For members of the public, if we have time at the end, please use the chat feature if you'd like to speak. And we will turn to you at the end and then review you when you're done speaking. As I said, chat feature just for requesting to speak. If we do vote today, I don't know if we will, but if we do, only committee members, so members of the Committee on Regulation have voting privileges. Please don't vote if you are not a committee member. I have the roster and Leanne will be of great help in tabulating any votes. So with that, I am going to turn it over to our consultants, Chris Kerrigan and Stuart Shapiro, and they can give us an overview of the research, and then we'll turn to discussion.
Thank you very much, Connor, and we will be brief. And as Connor noted, happy to take any suggestions on the report offline. Feel free to email Chris and myself, and we'll be happy to get feedback as we work on revisions on the report. I would like to thank ACUS for the opportunity to work on this report. It was a fun project to work on, and the support provided by Leanne, Bobby, and Reeve has been fantastic, and we really appreciate it. So the ideas of participation by the public and analysis of regulation have been key parts of the rulemaking process for a long time. Participation, obviously, notice and comment, obviously goes back to the Administrative Procedure Act in 1946, and analysis in some form or another dates to the early 1970s. And of course, agencies did analysis before that too, it just wasn't formalized. Participation and analysis can really work together. Having outside participants look at the analysis, correct things that are wrong, provide information that the agencies don't have makes for better analysis. An analysis that is simple and transparent and easy to understand can help facilitate participation by allowing people to better understand the consequences of agency proposed regulations. But for them to work well, for participation and analysis to work well, either separately or together, a number of things need to be true. And among those, not exclusively those, are that participation has to occur at a time when it can still affect the agency's decision. And analysis has to include meaningful alternatives to the agency proposal. The literatures on cost-benefit analysis and on notice and comment have largely been skeptical, to be honest, that these two conditions are often met. Sometimes they are met, to be sure, but the comment process has been called by Donald Elliott kabuki theater, and analyses have been criticized as having few alternatives that are meaningful. Oftentimes, you see alternatives that are unrealistic, thereby making the proposal look very good in comparison. It was with these concerns in mind, I think, that ACUS asked Chris and I to examine the agency use of early participation, particularly in reference to consideration of alternative policies. So having been given this charge, what did we do? First thing we do is we reviewed the literature that I referenced before, and the numerous requirements coming from many different places: the Regulatory Flexibility Act, the Executive Orders 12866, NEPA, SBREFA, acronyms I'm sure you're all familiar with. We then examined 25 economically significant regulations from the Obama and Trump administration. And in particular, we focused on those regulations for which agencies measured both benefits and costs, because we figured these are the ones that had the most analytical detail put into them, or analytical effort put into them, and therefore were the ones most likely to consider alternatives. For each of these regulations, we, along with a research assistant who did most of the work on this, read the NPRM, the final rule, and the regulatory impact analyses. And from these documents, we documented both descriptions of early public involvement and the the consideration of alternatives. We then spoke with representatives of 5 departments whose agencies issued rules that were in our data set. These were 1-hour interviews and focused both on how agencies typically engage the public prior to the NPRM, and how they selected alternatives, considered alternatives, and weighed them and presented them to the public. So that's what we did. I'm going to turn it over to Chris to talk about what we found.
Thanks, Stuart. Yes, so I think one of the things that maybe, I guess, somewhat surprised us actually was the, and underscored kind of the value, at least from our perspective, of taking an approach that required or relied on multiple methods, was that the results that we got from the 2 approaches, one the document review, the other the interviews, actually had a different character to them. So, you know, the way we kind of thought about it is if we had done one or the other, we might have written a report that looked quite a bit different. Particularly if we had just kind of focused on the document review, but hadn't done the interviews, we might have reached some different conclusions. But so for, you know, from an academic exercise for Stuart and I, it was quite interesting and kind of underscore, I think both of us value kind of a multiple methods approach, but kind of underscored for us the value of that. And from that work, we were able to, I think, pull out 4 major themes. So through our analysis, 4 major themes, which I'll just briefly describe. The first one is that by and large, agencies do engage in significant consideration of alternatives. This is particularly true if the rulemaking involves more complex or novel issues. So if regulating in a new area or something of that nature, agencies are more apt to see the value for sure and also engage proactively in considering a variety of different alternatives. Yeah, so we saw lots of evidence and lots of examples that agency personnel were able to provide of how they did this outward engagement, and I'll get to that piece here in a second. But and the other part of it was that they definitely universally understood and valued the idea of engaging in the process of vetting alternatives, that it helped to generate in their mind better rules. So for sure. So that was the first kind of theme that we pulled out, mainly in that part through the interviews, I would say. The second one was that although the methods varied quite dramatically in how those alternatives were derived and vetted, largely the development of alternatives came from outside the agency. To the extent that in our discussions, it was very hard to even disentangle the two. So it was very hard to have a conversation about alternatives without discussing external stakeholder participation in the process. They almost become one and the same for the agency. So the process of developing alternatives comes largely from external sources. To the extent it was internal in our discussions, economists played an important role, I think largely because of their role, obviously, in generating regulatory impact analyses and the role of alternatives in kind of preparing those documents. But again, largely externally. The third theme was that, as you might expect, certainly given the theme of this project, that the alternatives and the vetting of alternatives happened very early in the process. So well before the notice of proposed rulemaking was issued, agencies had engaged in the process of vetting alternatives and considering alternatives, to the point to which very little new information in terms of new alternatives was derived through the notice of proposed rulemaking, or so the comments that they received. So very, most of the time they had already kind of considered any of the alternatives that arose during that commenting process, or that was their indication. What's interesting, though, in connection to that is that although, the interviews disclosed and kind of the, robust vetting of alternatives that occurs within agencies, and lots of really interesting examples of how that affected the outcomes of rules, the documents themselves in our document review kind of revealed a bit of a different picture. By and large, to the extent of, I would say it's very uneven in terms of the public disclosure in those rulemaking documents of consideration of alternatives. And to the extent, as Stuart kind of suggested, to the extent that alternatives are disclosed in those documents, ordinarily it's in the regulatory impact analyses. That's where that vetting of alternatives or the description of alternatives occurs. And oftentimes it covers kind of unrealistic alternatives. So the qualitative nature of the types of alternatives that are disclosed in the public rulemaking documents are different from the types of alternatives that are being considered in the process itself when the agency is developing the rule earlier in that process. And then the final thing, the final theme I would say is that, like I said, the agency personnel that we spoke with universally agreed that the consideration of alternatives was certainly valuable, but there was a recognition of the potential for costs associated with that, to the extent that they engage in a robust effort to vet alternatives that involves for them developing processes around engaging parties outside of the agency, external stakeholders, and there is some cost in terms of time associated with that, potentially adding in certain situations, the possibility that the process could extend longer than it already does. And then, related to those cost was, or potential limitations, was this notion that occasionally there's political considerations, but also statutory restrictions on the ability to widely consider alternatives in some circumstances. And so, our report itself focused on these themes, and the recommendations naturally arose from those themes to the point in which the recommendations themselves are actually embedded in our discussion of those themes. And then, just broadly, the foundations and recommendations are kind of along the lines of the themes and some of the things I just mentioned. Thinking about creating opportunities for learning among agencies. So agencies appear to be somewhat idiosyncratic in terms of the approaches that they take to try to generate information on alternatives and to vet alternatives. And encouraging learning among agencies to the extent that their approach might rely on history or something of that nature, to learn about best practices, potentially to be able to engage a broader array of stakeholders, potentially through various means. So that was kind of one foundation for the recommendations and recommendations are trying to accomplish. And then the second was trying to encourage disclosure in the public documents of the robust vetting of alternatives that through early engagement that's kind of already taking place at agencies. So in other words, mitigating or minimizing the perceived inconsistency between what agencies do and really what they describe in the documents they publicly release, which could affect public views of the rulemaking process and kind of move some of the vetting and engagement of the public to parts of the regulatory process that are not within view to the broader public. So I guess probably appropriate to stop there, but as Stuart mentioned, and of course Leanne mentioned, we would love to receive any comments that you have on the report itself as we think about our revisions over the next few weeks. Thanks.
Oh, well, thank you, Stuart and Chris. I appreciate the great research and the overview. Before we dive into discussion, I just want to briefly recognize Sean McGibbon, the General Counsel of ACUS, for a short announcement on participation rules.
Good afternoon, everyone. Given the large number of sort of non-ACUS members that we have present at today's meeting, I thought it was especially important to point out who can participate in today's meeting. So if you are not an ACUS member, alternate, or consultant, our bylaw provisions state that at both advance approval of a request to speak must occur prior to the meeting, and as well, unanimous consent of the chair and the committee members must happen before any member of the public can speak. So if you're not an ACUS member, alternate, or consultant, then those two things are required, both advance approval and unanimous consent of the chair and the committee. So just wanted to share that.
And Sean, I think that this is Matt. I think that Reeve and Leanne will need to tell us who has received advance approval if that's an issue.
Sure. Okay.
Thank you, everybody. So with that, I will open up the discussion. Before we dive into the recommendation one, I will just open up for about 20 minutes of general comments from ACUS members, general comments. You just use the chat function if you don't mind. Just give it a minute here, and then if not, we'll dive into the recommendation. Okay, hearing none, then we'll start with recommendation 1. And so that's, and Leanne, I don't know if you want to put the recommendation up on the screen, but we'll just go recommendation 1, lines 32 to 41. And just to really, I promise we will circle back with plenty of time to the preamble, but it'd be great to get thoughts on the recommendation first. And we have a note from Leanne noting the committee members may have additional factors that we want to discuss. And we have a comment from the Institute for Policy Integrity, which I will not read to you, but I welcome comments on the IPI comment or additional factors or other thoughts. Any thoughts on recommendation 1 from ACUS members? If your computer is like mine, the chat function went to a separate box, so you may need to reopen it. I'm opening it here. Erica. Erica,
sorry. Yep, got it. I had a couple of ideas that I thought would track more or add some more thoughts, both from the preamble, from the report. One might be the extent of the, I'm not sure what the word would need to be, the discretion or the latitude the agency has given the statutory language that it's implementing in the first instance. How much room it has to consider alternatives, in other words, it's a legal matter. I think another one might be, and this would track what's in the report, the agency's experience in that policy space. That was the phrasing that was used in the report, but how much experience it has with issues that raise these kinds of issues might be something to add. And I suppose maybe even factors relevant to timing, such as whether it has a statutory deadline that it needs to worry about, or potential costs or harms that might come from the prolonging of the rulemaking process that would occur.
Erica, on the experience point, do you see that as being related to current letter A, the familiarity with alternatives, or do you see that as sort of your point as a broader point?
Yeah, my point was actually more to the substance of what it was doing. So in other words, I think the report talks about the sort of the complexity and the novelty of the issue that the agency is grappling with. And I guess I would think if this is, that should be, and maybe that's captured in part by D, but I guess I was thinking if this is an area where the agency has sort of had occasion to think through, well, there are sort of 5 different ways to skin this cat, please don't quote me. If they've had the occasion to do that thinking before, they might not be as inclined to seek early input. Whereas if this is something, just a whole new area, program area, raising all sorts of issues it hasn't had to grapple with, that might be one that's ripe for early input. And maybe that's captured a little bit by A and B. Maybe it is, but it was, maybe it is sufficiently, I'm not sure.
I'd be curious for our consultant's reaction on how this sort of tracks what you saw when you were looking at your rules and talking to folks at agencies.
Yeah, I think agency experience was definitely something that we found. I mean, we had a number of people tell us that if it's an issue that we've never regulated in before, getting input from the public is more critical to our development, not only of alternatives, but even the preferred alternative of the agency. And so, yeah, I do think agency experience with the issue as a whole is an important factor there.
Yeah, and I would just add to what Stuart said, again, kind of building off what we heard. The opposite would be where the input or consideration of alternatives may not be as valuable, would be something where there's a periodic update to a rule that's kind of embedded in that, maybe there's a different number or something of that nature. So this kind of like periodic updating where the process of considering alternatives has already occurred at an earlier stage when the rule was originally written. And this is just kind of like a minor revision or update to that rule. So that would be the opposite end of the spectrum relative to the one that's raising novel issues or entering into a new area where the agency doesn't have as much experience in regulating.
That's helpful. Other reactions to Erica's additions? Proposed additions. Is there any objection to adding H through J, or the caveat committee on style may do some minor editing? Okay.
Sorry, this is Chenyu. Sorry, I wasn't sure what the protocol was here, but I do think it might be helpful to consider combining A and I. Initially, I wasn't sure if experience was referring to an agency's experience on a particular issue or the agency's general expertise in a broader area. So it sounds like we're really talking more about historical experience with a particular issue. So I think it'd be helpful to add it to A.
Something like familiarity with the policy issues and key regulatory alternatives.
I think that would be fine.
Erica, what's your sense of that? And then strike I.
Seems fine.
Any other reactions? Jen, that was sort of my original inclination too, so I think that makes sense if others agree. I'll recognize Charlie Maraska from SBA.
Thanks, Connor. I have an overall question about recommendation 1, given that in the report, which was remarkable, and something that closely tracks our experience, the agencies are much more willing to think about regulatory alternatives very early on in the process, but recommendation 1 seems to get to the early input with alternatives already somewhere on the table. And maybe I'm not being clear, but it seems like some of these recommendations assume that there are alternatives, regulatory alternatives already under discussion. And I'm just wondering, is that an assumption that underlies this particular recommendation, or are we still at that early stage where the agencies are still, say, compiling a list of potential regulatory alternatives?
Chris and Stuart, you could probably speak to how you kind of concede the posture here.
I mean, I think the point of early input is not only on alternatives already suggested by the agency, but also for the offering of alternatives that perhaps have not been considered. As Chris noted, by the time they get to the proposed rule stage, agencies probably have considered many of the viable alternatives. But that's not true, as Charles noted, much earlier in the process. And that is, and I think part of the goal here is for members of the public, and as Chris and I noted, this does happen informally quite a bit, to suggest alternatives as well as offer input on ones that the agency has presented. Chris? Do you have anything else?
I mean, my sense is it actually probably is more about where is the source of the alternatives. My perception was that the source of the alternatives is coming from outside the agency, and the creation of those alternatives. So it's not just we have a set of alternatives and we want to get reactions to them, but yes, the creation of the alternatives and the number of alternatives to consider and the depth at which we consider alternatives should be affected by these sorts of factors, the complexity and the novelty of the area and that sort of thing. So I agree with Charles's point.
Is that helpful, Charlie?
Well, to the extent that somebody agrees with me, finally, I guess it is. The problem that I see then in recommendation 1 is that A, B, and maybe A and B and maybe some of the others sort of assume, or at least imply very strongly, that there are, for example, key regulatory alternatives, how much knowledge is involved in the alternatives. So if what you're saying, if what we're discussing is as these alternatives are being brought forward, these are the considerations for each of them. It's probably more of a style issue, but it seems like the implication of several of them is that there's already a determination of what the alternatives are, rather than here are the issues that will be discussed when an alternative is brought forward. That's my main concern with recommendation 1.
Would adding some language in the first clause at lines 32 to 33 help that to clarify the scope of what each of these speaks to? Would that be helpful?
Well, the lines 32 and 33 are problematic. It should say something like, well, I don't know. I actually don't know where to go with this. When determining whether or not to seek early input on regulatory alternatives is not a good start, because if I understand it correctly, what we're saying in recommendation 1 is when an alternative is brought forward, agencies should consider factors such as, because the early input itself is going to be regulatory alternatives now.
Erica, what's your reaction?
I had the same concern when I read it. I first was not certain if this was supposed to be about identifying, getting input on the alternatives, or whether it was about input that identifies the alternatives or input on the alternatives. And it seems to be both. And I think, for me at least, the solution would just be to be clearer up front that some of this is about input that identifies alternatives and some of it is about input on identified alternatives, because I think it's about both.
I agree with that.
The drafting, I would say early input that identifies alternatives, or early input about alternatives, or input about, yeah. Yeah, that's what I.
Would it help to say identifies potential alternatives, so something, the idea that there are new alternatives? What do folks think about this language, Charlie?
At first glance, that looks good, Connor. I'm pretty sure this would be okay.
It's something we could also think about, wordsmith at the next meeting as well. Other reactions from the committee on the edits, lines 32, 33. Before we, I want to, Elliot Laws is asking about the IPI alternatives, so we can discuss those in a second, but I neglected, I want to briefly recognize Reed Bull for a comment.
Great, thanks, Connor. So want to make just a quick clarification as to the rules for recognition. Everybody who's on this call, whether or not the person is an ACUS member, everybody on the Zoom call will be deemed to have received advance consent to make any comment. The ground rules, however, remain the same in the sense that, Connor, as you noted at the outset, for anybody who is not a member of ACUS, whether or not on the committee, or an alternative for an ACUS member, we should wait till the end of the meeting for those comments, and it would require both Connor's consent as well as the consent of all other members of the regulation committee for those individuals to speak. But as far as advanced consent to that Sean had mentioned earlier, that will be deemed to have been granted for everybody on the call. So just wanted to make that quick clarification. Thanks.
Thank you, Reeve. Elliot, I agree. Let's turn to the IPI recommendations. Thank you for that. Elliot, do you want to speak to the IPI? I see your comment, but go ahead and just speak to it if you'd like.
No, I don't have anything really beyond that, Connor. It just struck me that 1 and 3 are pretty obvious and important, but I think if they're not included, they run the risk of being overlooked as agencies go through this process. And I just thought that they should be included as well. I know we run the risk of coming up with a list of items that are too long, and I guess we'll have to address that later on in the process. But I particularly thought 1 and 3 were important. I do believe that the concept behind number 2 is already captured in the document.
I agree on number 2. What do folks think about the comment from IPI on these 3 points, though? Is there objection to adding these? Additional thoughts on anything in number 1? Okay, then hearing none, we'll turn to number 2, which is, you may, Leah, if you take it off print view, it might all fit in the screen, which might help us. Number 2, which is focusing on methods of public input. And here I would note that ACUS did a, if you just double click on the gray space, sorry to be between the pages, that should get rid of the spacing. ACUS has done fairly recent, I know Matt or Reeve can speak to this, fairly recent helpful recommendation in this area. So different methods of outreach. And this tracks many of these, but anyway, here are ideas of ways to solicit output. And as Leah notes, we welcome additional ideas. And after we do discuss that, we can talk about the IPI's comment. While we wait, IPI flags potential alternatives and affected groups of stakeholders, including those that are underrepresented in the regulatory agendas and plans. My sense is regulatory agenda and regulatory plan, which I know has been the focus of a separate ACUS recommendation. My sense is the agenda and the plan are a little bit outside of the scope of this recommendation, which ACUS has addressed previously. But I wonder what others think, if they disagree with that assessment. And somewhere I think we could probably see fit to refer to that ACUS recommendation of regulatory agendas and plans in the preamble, probably as a footnote. We have to make sure it makes sense, but that seems like a possibility. Let's see here. Bill Funk.
Yes, Mike, I have a concern about transparency with respect to outreach to different interest groups. And so I would recommend at the end of recommendation number 2, an additional sentence on the order of agencies should consider how to ensure that its interactions with outside persons is transparent to the public. Some of these things are necessarily would be publicly available, but others would not necessarily be. And to avoid the claim or even perhaps the reality of special interests having special access, I think the making sure that it's all transparent would be beneficial.
That makes sense. Bill, do you think we need a caveat such as to the extent consistent with privacy and other legal obligations? I'm just drafting on the fly, but some sort of caveat along those lines.
I'm not
confidentiality. Sorry.
I just wonder to what extent that I tried to imagine, because later on in recommendation number 5, there is some consideration of that concept, and I will have a comment there. But I had a hard time figuring out when would legal privacy interests, as opposed to somebody's individual privacy interests of not wanting to be identified. But otherwise, I can't imagine when there would be a legal requirement to keep it private.
To the extent that private entities have requested confidentiality for some trade secret or something like that, is kind of what comes to mind immediately. I'm having not considered this in much depth.
Well, my point was not that the information that they would give would necessarily always be public, but the fact that they are meeting with these people to ask for alternatives should be transparent. And that, it seems to me, I don't think there actually should be any privacy interests in that. If somebody wants to speak to a federal agency about a public matter that the agency is considering, then the fact that they're speaking to the agency should be, I think, public.
Reactions from others on this point. Do folks feel we need any caveats, or is this sort of, as Bill said, general enough that we don't need to speak to caveats?
I mean, I would have no objection to the extent that's consistent with legal requirements. I'd have no problem with that, because I don't know of any legal requirements that would keep it from being transparent. But if there are, then certainly they should be consistent with that.
Objection to including that, and I think Steph Tatham has a hand up. So Steph Tatham.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to say that, I'm also not really aware of any privacy or confidentiality for the vast majority of these. The only one where I wonder if that may ever come into play is a focus group. And, you know, in my experience, I've seen sometimes agencies use focus groups, including to gather information about compliance with existing regulations. And in those cases, you know, some of that information and the specific identities of individuals might be kept internal to the researcher and not ultimately shared with the agency to ensure the ability to speak candidly in those sorts of settings. So, you know, I'm not sure what the right way to tackle that is, but in general, you know, I'm very supportive of the idea that these interactions should be transparent.
Thank you. Yeah, Steph, that's a good example of another one that has come to mind for me is sometimes in the supervisory process, regulated entities are nervous about the line between what's subject to agency supervision and what's subject to more the regulatory side, and get nervous about one side informing the other. That's the other example that came to mind to me. But perhaps something about legal requirements is a general enough caveat. Other reactions to Bill's suggestion as drafted. I'll recognize Marianne Zobler.
Oh, hi. Thank you. I actually, well, that's not why the question, but I like to extend consistent with legal requirements. I know in my agency, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, will have meetings that are closed because they deal with certain security or safeguards issues. So we would close those meetings, even if though the fact that there is the meeting is of course noticed that we're meeting with, say, our licensees, but we would not make the contents of those meetings necessarily public because of those concerns. So, so I agree with what's going on there. I had a question regarding some of these outreach items. Is the intent, I'm worried about things like internet and social media forum, only because they're very difficult to capture. And so if there's an expectation with some of these methods that there's some kind of discussion later in, say, the proposed rulemaking, you know, it's very difficult to be able to capture something like what went on the internet or Facebook or whatever. And so I suppose they can be considered, but part of that consideration would be, well, how would we capture those conversations? And so I was just wondering what the expectation would be if an agency were to use something like an internet forum to gather early input.
Stuart and Chris, did you come across this? And after Stuart and Chris, I'd be curious from many other agency folks who have encountered this issue.
So I mean, Stuart, you correct me if I'm wrong. I don't remember any direct indication that was being used as one of the mechanisms. Most of the others, yes, most of the others were mentioned directly, but I don't recall hearing an agency, someone from at least the ones we interviewed, indicating that was one approach that they had used.
Yeah, no, me neither.
Any agency folks encountered this issue? Mary, I guess my reaction is this. I recognize your point. I certainly open to some language. I think the problem would be more acute in the stage of drafting the notice of proposed rulemaking. But if you have thoughts or suggestions, I think it's worth noting, especially because this is an evolving area for agencies, as more and more agency outreach is done on different internet platforms, online platforms, I should say.
Yeah, and I actually think ACUS did a report on this maybe a year or so ago, because that's why it's sounding familiar to me. I mean, I mean, I guess I don't want to say delete it, because you know, if an agency finds a way to use that approach to get early input, then far, who are we to say not to? I guess it's just an issue that is something that as agencies begin to look at how are we going to adopt or approach ACUS's recommendations, that it's the general counsel's job to say, hey, okay, when you do it, keep those things in mind. And so, I mean, I'm fine to I'm not suggesting delete it. I just was raising it as, I guess, just something that people need to think about if they're going to implement it. So I don't suggest any changes in that regard, unless agencies, I mean, consistent with available resources. And now I'm just sort of thinking offline. I don't want to take up too much time. Just some language in the preamble of recommendation 2, where you say consistent with available resources. And I mean, I'm throwing out practicality, but that's not a really good word. But hopefully you understand what I'm trying to say.
Mhm.
Available resources and
It is the ability to implement, but I'm not sure what the right word is.
yeah, that's sort of where I'm.
Feasibility.
Feasibility. I mean, maybe that works for my, what I'm thinking about.
Maybe we should think about citing the ACUS recommendation on social media, the engagement in social media as well in the preamble.
Yeah, that's really where it came. My thought came from. So
Yeah,
I want to credit ACUS on that one. So
yeah, in the preamble, I think is the. I didn't realize that we had this function where folks can raise their hand, but I see Chin has raised her hand. So comments, Chin?
Yeah, so this is sort of related, but in terms of the transparency, I was just thinking about some of our procedures. And after we've opened a formal docket, we have procedures for reporting ex parte interactions, but I'm more thinking about how to do these sort of early input activities without unduly burdening folks' ability to provide input, especially historically underrepresented groups, because I know from experience that some members of these groups have had some pause about participating because they don't know how to deal with the ex parte obligations. So I'm just wondering, if there's something we could insert here along the lines of agencies should consider how to ensure that their interactions with other persons are transparent while not unduly burdening their ability to provide early input. I was wondering if that concept could be considered.
Stuart and Chris, what's your sense?
This did not really come up in our discussions, but one thing we certainly saw and we talk about in our report some is that, as Chin's indicating, the agencies are very concerned every step of the way to sort of be towing the letter of the law. And so we certainly wouldn't want to recommend anything that would impinge on their ability to do so.
I guess my sort of initial reaction is that all these different methods of soliciting input are sort of going above and beyond the traditional paper method. So these would generally, all else equal, kind of provide additional opportunities to provide input. So I might favor something more like a general statement, like, agencies should be cognizant of the ability of individuals to provide input or something like that. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure these methods would burden anybody's ability because they're additional. I don't know what other folks think.
Connor, I'm just not sure why it would go in this sentence. What's going to unduly burden individuals' ability to provide input? The fact that it's transparent that they are providing input. I mean, I agree. We don't want to unduly burden anybody's ability to provide input, but I just don't see why it's particularly relevant to this sentence.
Yeah, I guess just my concern is I don't want this to suggest to agencies that they should be imposing additional requirements here procedurally with respect to these informal methods of input that we've outlined in section 2.
Well, I just didn't see if there'd be any procedures applicable to the people who are providing input.
How about a new sentence? So, yeah, where the cursor is, so say, in soliciting input through these possible methods, I'm just making this up, agencies should be cognizant of the ability of individuals to provide input.
That's fine. That's fine with me.
That's not the world's best drafting, but that's, we could probably, clean that up, but
Did I get that right, Connor?
yeah, but we should probably, maybe instead of provide input, well, maybe soliciting feedback through these, so we don't use input twice, input through these possible methods, agencies be cognizant of the abilities. I don't know. We could, committee on style can make that better, but what do folks think of the general idea? Jim, what do you think of the general idea?
I think it sort of couches what I was trying to get at, but I would definitely defer to stylistic improvements.
Yeah. If folks have quick ideas about making the drafting better, I welcome them. Well, yeah, why don't you and I work on that between now and the next meeting? And I think we could probably tighten it up and make it more consistent with the beginning, but we don't have to spend everybody's time on it if folks generally like the idea, the concept.
For sure. And Connor, can I just jump in and say, if you are using the hand raising function to indicate you want to talk, if you could remember to unraise your hand so it doesn't look like you're constantly trying to talk, that would be really helpful.
Good point. Steph, did you have something else you wanted to add, or were you re-raising, or just raised and still up? Additional comments, number 2. Hearing none, we'll go on to number 3. And the idea is about testing, exploring different methods of soliciting public input, and detailing these in the NPRMs. Stuart and Chris, did you want to say anything quickly about your research on number 3?
I think here we were drawing both on our conversations with the agency and on the literature, and that there's a lot of ideas out there about soliciting input and participation, and we didn't want to pretend that we had an exhaustive list of doing so. And the idea, particularly in an age of social media and other evolving technologies like Zoom and such, that there might be new ways of doing so.
Feedback on number 3. Hearing now, we'll go on to number 4, which is sort of an internal agency process point, which I think Stuart and Chris spoke to in their introductory remarks. And this also includes a point we discussed in number 1, which is fine, which is outreach to other agencies. I think that was one of Erica's ideas, I think. But the idea here is internal consultation and external consultation. So welcome comments on number 4. Okay, hearing none, we'll go on to number 5, which is to provide the discussion of the this is something we kind of discussed a little bit on the earlier point, but this is given discussion in the NPRM. Bill, this has some of the same concern. And the idea here is provide discussion of all the alternatives, and then the extent that there's concern about privacy or confidentiality, don't have to ascribe to particular groups. So I welcome reactions on this language and this broader point in number 5.
Connor, I would say I like the Institute for Policy Integrity's suggestion for the first sentence. And I think, we should consider that before the second sentence.
Agencies should provide the NPRM a full discussion of alternatives agencies already considered, including alternatives is not proposing to adopt, together with reasons why. So it's a little bit more fulsome comments on the IPI's revised language.
And the idea, I think, their idea was that you haven't written them off from consideration. It's just you're not proposing.
Sure. The ultimately rejected line is
Right.
sounds a little bit closed-minded.
Right.
When I read that in IPI's comment letter, I thought that was sensible, but I welcome reactions. I think that's helpful. Any objection to the IPI change? Bill, did you have a corresponding comment on the second sentence of 5?
Yes, I did. I would suggest adding something. This would be after the introductory clause. It should say they should, that being the agencies, they should consider characterizing the entity, paragraph, e.g. industry representative, environmental interest group, and paragraph, or listing the alternatives without ascribing them to any particular individual or group. So
Could you repeat what you had in the
Yep.
EG section?
yeah, e.g. industry representative, comma, environmental interest group. That's it.
Bill, how would you feel about public interest group, just to broaden?
Fine. It's just, some people would say that every interest group is a public interest group. Industry always says it's representing the public as well. So that's the only reason. But no problem.
That term may have more defined, understood meaning in some policy
Yep.
realms than others. That's a good point. What do folks think?
There may be, this is Matt, there may be precedent for how to describe the groups in prior ACUS recommendation that doesn't give offense to anyone. Public interest group is often resisted at the plenary session. That's sort of my experience. Reeve might be able to elaborate here.
Yeah, exactly. We can take a look at those past recommendations and sort of come up with the optimal language, but I definitely agree on public interest. I think that's probably something we'd want to avoid.
Thank you. It's a good sense that we can check. Do folks think that the language in the first part of the second sentence of 5, so it's lines 80 through 285, should be conformed to the corresponding point about confidentiality and privacy? I think that we added earlier, I think on 1 or 2, where we talked about legal, you can scroll up, legal requirements. Yeah, do we want to conform those? Or do we think it's better to expand at number 5, on this at number 5?
I think that's something we should look at in the next session. In other words, when we get through all of this, we can try to figure out how to best coordinate this section with section 3 or section 2, and rather than try to wordsmith it now.
Sure.
I mean, I think the idea is if we're in agreement on both of these things, we should be able to make them work together.
David Rosker notes I think that makes sense, Bill. Dave Rasser knows the term non-governmental organizations. Maybe that's better than public interest groups for the reasons that Matt and Reeve were saying, but we can check that later. I don't want to go into the weeds. Just want to mention it for the document, Leanne. Charlie Maraska.
Connor, again, an overall concern. We're mostly talking about what should happen in the early stages of rulemaking, but here we're talking about the NPRM, which, as we know, is virtual, is the latter stage of rulemaking. And agencies, as the study points out, agencies do consider alternatives early on that don't quite make it into print. And yeah, and I'm hardly the best representative of other agencies, but if agencies wanted to discuss the alternatives they had considered, they would be doing it. And this recommendation seems to, the study points out that there should be some benefit to the agency of doing, responding to these recommendations. And here there's a lot, in my experience, there's a lot of reticence to on the part of the agencies to discuss alternatives they had considered. Our experience, under the Reg Flex Act, where agencies are required to consider alternatives, they still don't want to discuss what they've considered in the NPRM and definitely in the final rule. So, I like the recommendation that they should do this, but I don't understand what's in it for the agencies to have such a discussion. And the report goes into some detail on what agencies might, why they might not want to do this. But we don't seem to have the groundwork for this recommendation, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Chris and Stuart, I'm curious on your reaction.
So yeah, I think that's a really great comment. And I don't know that I agree with the last sentence of it, but everything right up until that last sentence, I was nodding my head here. And I do think that Chris and I discovered this dichotomy between what agencies are actually doing and then what they are describing in the preamble. And this recommendation, as we talked about, and I think this is probably the one we struggled with the wording the most, to be honest, is designed to try and say they should be discussing what they've been doing. And I think that's the wording we left it with, and that ACUS decided to leave it with here. Ideas on sort of altering the incentive structure that Charlie was talking about in terms of what would get agencies, or what would incentivize agencies to have that discussion, and what barriers are there to having that discussion, I think is a worthwhile one.
Before I turn to Bill Funk, do any agency folks have a reaction on this point? Bill?
I thought the report, I don't think I made it up out of my head, but I thought the report made a good case for that. This would be good evidence of having thoroughly considered the issues in any challenge to the rule, that you engaged in a reasoned process, you'd considered alternatives early on, you explained why you didn't adopt them, that this would more greatly insulate you from a possible reversal. And I think that's true, that this would in fact help you in the courts if you did this. And so I'm not sure whether agencies would be convinced that this is enough of an incentive, but nevertheless, I think that is an incentive that's possible and is true. So I think it's a good idea, even if agencies might be reluctant to do it.
I think Erica has a comment on this that also relates to number 6, which is related. So Erica.
Yes, so I mean, and we haven't gotten to 6 yet, but 6 also talks about discussing alternatives that were put forward and were rejected on the ground that the law wouldn't permit the alternative. And I read the explanation for that one in the report as, and this was, I think, page 12 of the report. The notion was that this would give Congress information about where statutory change might be needed. And the suggestion that I wanted to make when we get to 6 is that that be limited to reasonable alternatives, which is what the report says, but also that we think about whether it should be encouraged rather than mandated. And that's how this kind of ties in with number 5, because I read the same thing in the report that I think Bill Funk is remembering, which was the suggestion that laying all this out would go some way to persuading a court that the actual decision at the end of the day was not arbitrary or capricious. And I saw that in the report, and I think that provides an incentive perhaps for an agency to lay out all these things that they considered, and maybe a reasonable alternative that was put forward that they couldn't adopt because the statute didn't permit it, there would be an incentive perhaps to lay that out as well in that reasoning. So I like both of them for these reasons, that there may be good reason for the agencies to lay all this out. But I, for my own part, would want it to be less of a firm should provide, at least for the second one, at least for number 6. So that's what I wanted to say, and it kind of relates to both together.
Erica, one reaction I had on number 6 is too, sometimes agencies, or at least folks in agency general counsel's offices, are nervous about sort of making statements about not having authority that could be cited back against them. And so I think that's consistent with the kind of spirit behind it, your point, as I understand it. Marianne?
Hi. Yeah, I was actually looking at 5 and 6. I would suggest, similar to the prior comment about agencies should consider providing rather than the strong should, and two reasons. One is I worry about agency resources, because when we go to the final rule, we're going to respond to every comment we get on the proposed rule. So I think having to respond to every comment you get in the pre-rulemaking application is just one more level of burden on an agency trying to get a proposed rule out. But sometimes it's a good idea to do it. And the other is, are we talking about litigation? I mean, we're giving commenters sort of 2 bites of the apple, because again, you get out there with the proposed rule and you say, well, we consider these other alternatives and this is why we're not adopting them. And then the same commenters could come back and say, well, we think you should. Now, maybe in the final rule, you could say, well, we already, for the same reasons. I get that. But I just feel that in a true notice and comment rulemaking, you're going to get responses to the comments in the final, and commenters are always free to raise the same issues in the more formal proceedings. And so sometimes we actually encourage that when we tell a commenter, when time comes, please provide your comment at the proposed rule stage too. So, but there might be good reasons why you would want to do it. So that's why I would suggest should consider providing versus just that strong should.
Reactions before we go to other folks, reactions to Marianne's comments and edits.
I have a reaction,
Please.
Which is just that I would have said that that's a much more articulate way of saying the second point I was trying to make. So I agree completely.
Other reactions on this point? I see Peter Strauss. Peter, I think you're still muted, unfortunately.
Okay, I'm sorry to be late, but just as a general proposition about all of these, doubtless the age of 100-page statements of basis and purpose, and now we're going to have 100-page notice and comment notices, is upon us. But I really do think we need to be cautious about that. And one way of putting this kind of proposition which would be sympathetic to Executive Order 12866, is to instead suggest that in their dealings with OIRA under Executive Order 12866, agencies should be careful to let OIRA know about the alternatives that they've been that have been suggested to them in reaching out to the public.
Stuart and Chris, what's your reaction?
So I wanted to just make a comment about the incentives question, because I think there is somewhat competing incentives. Will agencies voluntarily disclose alternatives? I mean, there is one argument to be made, and we do kind of discuss it in the report that, so in some ways this offers protection by saying, yes, we reasonably considered alternatives and we had a method to considering or determining which one we went with, but there are certainly incentives moving the other direction. I think the literature in general would push in the other direction. And I think the evidence is kind of suggestive that the agency itself is not necessarily, I mean, just kind of looking at the evidence that they don't do it. So they're obviously the incentives are driving them away from doing that. So I just want to kind of clarify the incentives. I'm not sure that simply saying to the agencies they should consider doing that is going to convince them all of a sudden to do it. Even, setting aside Peter's good point about what it does to the length of the notice of proposed rulemaking.
Yeah, and I think that echoes Charlie's point to some degree that, there are some legal requirements that they do it, and there are instances where it is not done or not done meaningfully at the moment. And so, I think the reason we put should rather than should consider, and we considered even stronger language, but we were also mindful of the concerns that the agency representatives are voicing here, that is gonna does whether it alters their incentive structures or not, I'm dubious.
What was the last, Stuart? I couldn't hear the last part.
I'm sorry, whether just putting should consider in there. I mean, I don't even know whether putting should in there alters the incentive structures, but putting should consider, I think is even less likely to.
Charlie, did you want to speak further on this?
Yeah, I do, but except Connor, I don't really know what I want to say. The idea of early input and early consideration of alternatives is one that we support very strongly, and we would like to see the agencies do as much of it as they possibly can, and so maybe I should walk back, maybe if it sounded like a criticism earlier, my earlier statement about incentives, and that is if the point of early, from our point of view, the point of early consideration of alternatives and early input is that you get a better rule. Ultimately, from our particular point of view, you get a better rule for small businesses, but in general, you get a better rule if you have early input and you have sort of documentation of what you've considered from the beginning to the end. And so you get a stronger, and I would agree with the report writers, a more defensible rule. It's just not the way people do it now. That's the problem. And these recommendations are in the direction of overcoming the obstacles to those. And perhaps my point earlier, and I think this discussion of incentivizing and giving the agencies a little bit more leeway in whether they do or don't discuss alternatives considered doesn't really address the overcoming of those obstacles and somehow gaining agency confidence in early consideration of alternatives, early input from stakeholders and others. So that's my concern. They're not. It's a nice set of recommendations and certainly in a direction that we support, but there are a number of obstacles along the way. I guess that's it. Maybe I should just be quiet for a little while.
Bill, did you have a reaction, Bill Funk?
Well, I'm sort of responding down to Peter Strauss's comment, and I just wonder, I mean, I like the idea that Charlie just said that, you know, by saying should consider just is so wishy-washy, that, you know, we really want to say, yeah, we want you to provide this discussion, not just we want you to consider providing this discussion. This is, after all, a recommendation. It's not a requirement that people do something, it's a recommendation. So I was thinking if we should go back to agencies should provide in the NPRM. I guess I'd take out full discussion, just say a discussion, just to make, you know, to try to say this, it's not as much as you might have to do in a final notice of rulemaking where you finally making the final determinations, but this is first step. And I think that's what I would do here. I would go strong, but take out the full to make make it possibly shorter. And then on six.
Okay, let me just say one quick thing, Bill, if you don't mind. Leanne, can you just bracket this? And I think when everybody sees the revised version, we'll take a vote next meeting on this question of whether or not we want the should consider. And you can bracket the full or not, these two issues, and I include that for 6.2 should consider at lines 88 through 89. We'll just take a vote next meeting after everyone can see the revised version. So Bill, go ahead with 6, but we'll take the vote next meeting on the direction on that.
This is perhaps wordsmithing, but it seemed to me that the way it was currently phrased, it was almost like you were including as an alternative to be considered these things that were not legal. And so I just thought it should start off by saying, deleting in the discussion of alternatives, just say in the preamble of a proposed rules, agency should also either consider or include a discussion of alternative, and I would take out reasonable. What is a reasonable alternative?
Well, I do read reasonable as something, you know, that's in the ballpark of the problem the agency's trying to address. So all our guidance includes because sometimes people do write in with alternatives that are just completely unrelated to the rule.
And that was the wordsmithing part that I thought would approve it. But there was a more major issue was, and I'm now speaking as a former rule writer, I would want to say, why are we putting this in there? All right. And the answer is, well, because maybe we want the law to change. And in that case, then I don't want any reasonable alternative. I want the alternative that the agency would prefer. So if that would be a major change to this, but I like the idea of saying include discussion of any alternative that the agency would prefer, but which was legally prohibited or not legally available.
I'm a little bit worried there is just that we're going astray from the idea of the agency soliciting feedback on alternatives from the public and sort of going away from the main point of that, but I'm curious what other folks think.
So Connor, if I can, just repeating myself a little bit, I suppose. This reminds me of Don Elliott's remark at one point that the notice and comment process has turned into a kind of formal kabuki dance. And that everything that happens that's really important happens before the notice and comment period. And it strikes me that that this recommendation is even more in that direction. And I think we perhaps need to wonder about that. And second, that Hamlet is missing. To go back to what I said earlier on, this whole recommendation is all about the agency and what the agency is going to do and what's in various statutes. Well, Executive Order 12866 is mentioned in line 3, but not otherwise, and not the discussions with OIRA, and not the repeated emphasis in OIRA's communications to the agencies that, hey, go out and be in contact with the people who might be interested in this rule before you're in contact with us, and investigate alternatives. And so I don't know why this recommendation isn't framed in terms of the communication with OIRA under the executive order, at least as much as it is in terms of the communication with the public and the notice of proposed rulemaking.
Well, I mean, I do think the charge from the council focuses on public input and the public rather than other agencies and OIRA.
But once you get the public input, which under 12.866 you have an obligation to go after, then you're engaged in a conversation with OIRA before you get to the NPRM. And so that conversation, what happens, ought to be engaged with that process.
And so would you favor more discussion of the 12.866 process in the preamble, or a separate recommendation in the recommendation section focused on 12.866?
Well, I guess we haven't got to 7 yet. But I think that both the preamble and the recommendation ought to be aware that whatever is being done before the OIRA process. And when 7 talks about an interagency working group should be convened to share the results of agency efforts, unless that's, something like, let's get all the regulatory policy officers together and talk about how to engage in 12.866 processes. It seems like it's indifferent to what the agency is supposed to do under 12.866.
Let's hold 7 then until we just agree on 5 and 6 in principle, reach consensus. Let's hold 7, and then perhaps we can discuss 12.866 and 7 in the preamble if that's all right with you.
I'm just one voice.
Oh, we'll welcome edits on 7. Additional thoughts on 5 and 6 as they read now, and with the Leanne, do you want to make the IPI comment on 6 bigger so we can see that? I don't think we discussed the IPIs. That's fine.
Connor, small point on 6. The last edit there, talking about alternatives that agencies would prefer but believe are precluded by statute. If an option is precluded by statute, I'm not sure it's really appropriate for the agency to be putting in this discussion that the agency would prefer some other alternative. I'm just not sure if this is the right vehicle. I mean, if the agency doesn't have authority to do it, it doesn't have authority to do it. And in fact, I don't know that this is applicable here, but there are appropriations riders that prohibit agencies from sort of engaging in grassroots campaigns suggesting the public right into play, to support X or Y legislation. So I would just, I think it would be safer to take out the would prefer language.
In addition, I think OMB sometimes limits agencies to providing technical assistance. ACUS did a recommendation on technical assistance. Is that right, Reeve?
Yes, that's correct. About 3 or 4 years ago.
Perhaps we could refer to that, but Chin, I think that was you, Chin. I share your sense that generally, at least in my work at the SEC, because of appropriations law, as you noted, but also just I think general appropriations law, but also for other reasons, we're generally limited to providing technical assistance to Congress and not going further. So I do have that concern as well, but I'm curious what other folks think.
This is Steph Tatham from OMB. I would say that, we strongly support this recommendation, but I would agree with striking that additional language. I think, the agency can explain the costs and the benefits of the various alternatives quite clearly without having to pick a preferred alternative. I would just note that we do very much support agencies doing this in their impact analyses. With respect to 5 and 6, I just had a question. I noticed that at number 6, we're now discussing reasonable alternatives that the agency, that were suggested, but agencies believe were precluded by statute, whereas above, it's alternatives that the agencies has considered. And in 5, there's no reasonable delimiter. So I was wondering if the intent in 5 was to be exhaustive, excuse me, which I know might be a little bit difficult for agencies. So I think reasonable might be helpful there. And in 6, I would maybe make a minor adjustment in 6, because I think it's not just alternatives that were suggested through early public input, but that might include also alternatives that the agency considered. So perhaps add, or consider, exactly, great.
And would you favor a corresponding change in 5 suggested or considered, the idea of being agency line 80 to sweep in the suggestions that the earlier part of the recommendation speaks to?
Yeah, I think so. I think that makes sense. And then, in terms of if they should do it or if they should consider it, I think I personally prefer the stronger formulation. We think agencies should discuss reasonable alternatives.
Yeah, well, we can vote on that next time after we see it, the whole thing kind of cleaned up. What do folks think about Steph Tatham's edits? Additional comments in 5 and 6. Okay, let's do number 7, and then after that, we'll take a break for the before we go into the preamble. So
Connor, can I also mention,
yes,
sorry, really quickly, we received in our comments a number of additional recommendations people suggested adding, which we might want to talk about before going to the preamble if we want to talk about those.
got it. Okay, saying that, then we're over halfway. Let's take a 5-minute break now. So it is 2:37. Well, let's come back at 2:45. We'll start probably at 2:45. Let's see everybody at 2:45. Okay, Leanne, if you want to pull the screen back up, I think we can resume with number 7. And if Peter has suggested language to incorporate 12866 here, we can start with that. And then we can see what other folks think about number 7. I think we may also have an IPI comment, but Peter, the floor is yours if you want it.
Peter, I think you're muted.
No, there we go. I've not worked out language, but I would suppose instead of an interagency working group, group should be convened. A way of putting it might be as an element of the process, of the current process under Executive Order 12866. The agency should share the results of its efforts.
My sense is that what's currently in 7 is sort of a broader idea to sort of share results of essentially attempting to work on implementing this recommendation. So there's a working group to share results on making progress in this area, as opposed to kind of like routine business under 12866. But I'm curious what Leanne, Stuart, and Chris think.
If you're going to do that, which is fine, then I would say again, it's coordination with 12866. One element of the Council of Regulatory Policy Officers under 12866 could usefully be.
I'm sorry. Was that proposed language you had there, Peter, or are you just suggesting generally?
I haven't written out anything, okay. But I'm trying to respond to what Connor said, which makes perfect sense to me. And then I think it would be clearer that that's what we're talking about if one referred to the already existing interagency working group that's concerned with the general implementation of this kind of thing, which I take it is the collection of regulatory policy officers that OIRA oversees.
as part of an independent regulatory agency, I have no experience with that group, but Steph, I see you Steph Dathan from OIRA, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, and a couple of things is I had conceived of this recommendation as being, something broader, sort of a community practice where agencies could information share. I'm not sure that having OMB a part of that is always helpful. We're always happy to be involved in those sorts of interagency working groups, but when it becomes an OMB convened or overseen working group, that sometimes does have a slightly different flavor for agencies than something more casual and collaborative. So wanted to put that out there. But to Peter's point, I think it's an interesting suggestion. If it were the recommendation of the committee, I think I would encourage you all to include it as an option in the preamble discussion as opposed to the recommendation, because right now, that working group, we do have meetings of regulatory policy officers, but I don't think it's operating in the way that this is envisioned. So my recommendation would be if this language is kept, to put it in the preamble.
Current 7 without the red line to 12866. Is that right, Steph?
Yeah, if folks wanted the regulatory policy officers to do that under the 12866 process, I would say, I would recommend discussing that as an option in the preamble, but I would encourage consideration of other options, because our regulatory policy officer group just isn't quite working in that way right now, in the way that I think that this is envisioned, but I'm not, I'd be interested to hear from the consultants on their vision for this recommendation.
Yes. Stuart, this seems right up your alley.
Yeah, no, I think what we discovered in doing the work here was that there are a lot of different ideas out there among the agencies, and a lot of different practices out there in terms of soliciting early input, and that there is a tremendous opportunity for agencies to learn from each other. And I think that's what we're trying to get at with this recommendation. The who convenes and the how it's convened, I think, and Chris, you can step in here too, I think matters a little less to us, but rather that interagency sharing of information on what works and what doesn't work. We had a regulatory negotiation that dragged out for 2.5 years. Here are the mistakes we made. If you're going to do one, you shouldn't do one. You shouldn't do it this way, etc. It's those kind of things, that kind of information sharing between agencies that we're trying to get at here.
Yeah, I just to build off of what Stuart was suggesting. Yes, I agree with Stuart's point that it's less about who convenes and it's more about sharing ideas. And part of the thing, and perhaps I'm reading a bit too far into the research that we did and stretching it a bit, but I think some of the decision making around approaches to gathering alternatives is just historical artifact of this is the way we do it. Relative to kind of thinking about what would be the best approach in this particular situation to gather the set of feedback that would really benefit us. So it's somewhat idiosyncratic, the processes that agencies use. And so this is just an avenue to develop more knowledge around gathering information on alternatives, again, to make the rule ultimately better in the end of the day.
What would you all think of just sort of amending to say agencies should work or seek to share the results of their efforts to solicit? So just get rid of the process point and just encourage sharing.
Connor?
Yes.
Isn't that a function of ACUS? That is, if we're taking this outside in effect of, okay, let's have a formal working group. ACUS regularly looks after the implementation of its recommendations. And I don't know that it ever makes a recommendation to itself, but it sounds like what's being said is, in implementing or overseeing, whatever the language might be, the implementation of this recommendation, ACUS should help to coordinate, or ACUS should.
We did have consideration of ACUS being in this recommendation, but I don't know what Matt or Reeve or Leanne think, or others. I know we have made recommendations to the ACUS office of the chairman, but I defer to the ACUS or Sean, any of the ACUS folks on the appropriateness.
I completely defer to Matt on this one.
You can also consider it.
Yeah, I think if Matt and Reeve don't want to speak to it now necessarily, it's something we can talk about before the next committee meeting.
That would be fine. Peter, my request, if you're so inclined, if you'd like for us to consider a separate, like a number 8 on 12866, if you could, I'm happy to correspond with you. I'm sure Leanne would be too, or I would guess Stuart or Chris would be. We could correspond offline about a number 8 on 12866 for the committee to think about, but I think it might be difficult to draft it from scratch on the meeting.
Sure.
So I'll let ACUS, as Sean said, we'll let Matt Reeve think about number 7. And we'll come back. The document's getting busy. Leanne, did the Institute for Public Integrity or somebody else have a comment on? Oh, they did. You have the cursor there, focusing on developing practices for outreach to underrepresented groups. My own sense is we have that idea built in other parts, and there are a whole lot of, I think we should keep this sentence as general as possible to sort of refer to everything learned in this. And once we start singling out different issues, we will make it too long and lose the point. But I'm curious what other folks think about the IPI comment that Leanne has highlighted on the right. Okay.
Connor, this is Steph. I wondered if that was maybe a reaction to the language at the end of the sentence, which says for early engagement with interested parties. And I just wasn't sure if interested parties was broad enough to encompass the underrepresented groups that IPI commented on. So I'm just wondering if that's where their concern is coming from.
Got it. What would you all think about just striking with interested parties?
With others.
With others? What do you all think of that?
Or with the public?
With the public? What do you think of that, Peter? I like with the public.
Fine.
And it wouldn't make sense to have other agencies because agencies would be talking to other agencies about talking to themselves. So that makes sense to me. Okay, so before we move on, so I guess we have some additional ideas for further recommendations, but before we go to that, anything else on number 7? Okay, hearing none, we will consider.
Connor?
Yes.
This is Dave Oscar. I'm sorry for interjecting. My comment is that it seems like there are two different ideas in 7. The first is appropriate for an interagency working group made with the reg policy officers, and that is sharing the results of agency efforts. My concern is the second clause, which says systematically gather other data and produce guidance, which generally I wouldn't associate with an interagency working group of that nature. And so with that, I second Peter's question of whether or not, isn't it ACUS that would actually systematically gather other data and produce guidance on best practices? That's what we would normally ask ACUS to take on. And so my suggestion is that recommendation 7 focus on using the interagency process to share best practices, but the second clause, the systematic process, be something that ACUS take back and ask whether it should be a follow-up project.
Thank you, Dave. Well, we'll take this back with the ACUS folks, and we'll see what they think, and we'll come back. We'll discuss this at the next meeting. Leanne, could you make the comment bubble with the additional ideas bigger so we can all see it? I'm going to just give you my initial reaction, which is for the first one on IPI. I think probably updating circular A4 is beyond the scope of this, and it's also a work stream that I know OIRA is working on. I know Steph probably knows a lot about this. So my own sense is that the first IPI recommendation on A4 is not something that's in the scope of this report, but I welcome reactions from our consultants, from staff, or from anybody else.
Yeah, we did not consider, we talked a little bit, actually. We did think a little bit about A4 now that I think about it, but we did leave it out there because we do know that right now that is something that OIRA is working on, thinking about, etc. And so we did not put it in there, but I think I'd love to hear from OIRA on that.
Yeah, hi, this is Steph. We are working on an A4 modernization effort, and to the point of distributional impacts in the API comment, that definitely is something that I think is at front of mind, in that process. To date, it hasn't really focused on the alternatives, and certainly if the conference had a recommendation, that's something that we could consider. I guess my one request would be to avoid using a very definitive formulation, in part because circular A4 is a document that goes through peer review, and so we try not to make commitments about what's going to be in circular A4 before fully going through that internal process and an interagency review process. Yeah, I wouldn't have strong objections to including this. I'm not sure, given all the modernization, that it's going to be implemented immediately if it is recommended, but certainly I think we could consider it.
I have some reservations about putting an absolute minimum, given the range of rulemaking out there in different contexts, as a recommendation as well. I don't know that we have enough of a basis to be quite so definitive and specific, but
rather than being definitive and specific, and this is repeating myself to some extent, couldn't that be framed in terms of in developing alternatives, agencies should respect at least the minimum number of alternatives that may be required of them in the 12866 process?
my only worry on that, Peter, is, as you know, a big chunk of agencies are not subject to 12866, to which this recommendation is directed. And I think that could get us tangled up in that whole issue.
Not so big, and I hope not for very long.
Well, there we go. Yeah.
Connor, is this liked by enough people that I should be wordsmithing it in the document?
Well, let's hear those who want to proceed with this say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. Nay.
Nay.
Nay.
On a voice vote, I think we'll not proceed with this, but Peter, if you want to, or anyone else wants to submit language to Leanne and me and Stuart and Chris, please do. But for the moment, I think it takes us a little bit of field. I understand Steph's point, maybe not as far afield as I initial reaction, but I think it may take us a little bit also away from the council's charge here in the agency process. Let's go down. We have some suggested edits. Leanne, could you just scroll to the bottom? So maybe that is the bottom.
There's another one from the Institute for Policy Institute for Policy Integrity before we get to the ones below that.
Thank you.
This one.
Go ahead and read it. Go ahead. Thank you.
Add a recommendation that either OIRA or ACUS create guidance on how the general public can best inform the consideration of alternatives.
My reaction there is we don't want to be giving the public advice on interacting with agencies, and also the council's charge is sort of focused on agencies, but I'm curious what everybody else thinks. Okay, go ahead, really, and just read the number one from, or we have 4 from Kevin. I'll let folks, I don't want everybody to read all these, but does anyone wish to speak in favor of number one from Kevin Broomberg? Charlie, I know you have a lot of familiarity with, so the floor is yours if you want it, or others. Number 2 on white papers, providing white papers to stakeholders. My sense on this one is that would be quite prescriptive given the range of different rule-making projects and contexts, and it would be quite burdensome for agencies, and it'd be too specific. But does anyone wish to speak in favor of number 2? My sense on number 3 is something we already discussed, which is the idea of 3 regulatory alternatives. And again, that we don't want to be that prescriptive. I don't know that we have, Stuart and Chris should chime up here. I don't know if we have the basis to be that prescriptive, but I open number 3 to comments.
I think all of these would make Don Elliott very happy about his foresight in describing the real notice, the actual statutory notice and comment process as a kabuki dance.
Other reactions. Number 4, I worry a lot. Number 4 is going afield from our charge, which is about input, agency input at the pre-NPRM stage, and this is being prescriptive about cost-benefit analysis. So I don't view number 4 as within the charge that the council gave our committee, but I welcome others' thoughts.
Well, I had a couple of points here in reaction to 3 and 4 in particular. I mean, I think to the extent that incorporating the alternatives in the review of Circular A4 is merited, these are the kind of issues that would fit within that. But I defer to the committee and to OIRA on whether or not they want to do that. But these are the kind of things that a revision of A4 would include, presumably. In terms of the benefit cost analysis aspect, I'll highlight one thing we found in our report is that to the extent there's a discussion of alternatives in agency rulemaking documents, it tends to occur in the RIA, the regulatory impact analysis, rather than the preamble to the proposed rule. And the challenge there is that in many cases, the RIA is harder to find. You have to sort of be comfortable navigating regulations.gov and looking for the right file and figuring out which one is the most up-to-date file and such. And hence the earlier recommendation about putting more in the preamble. So I just did want to highlight that as well.
Thank you.
And I would just build on what Stuart said just real briefly. One of the things that we observe is that the qualitative nature of the alternatives discussed in the RIA are somewhat different than the alternatives more being considered at the early stage. So, I mean, that's another factor why perhaps it would be better served to try to encourage discussion of alternatives in the preamble relative to the RIA.
Of course, agencies have different RIA obligations, especially independent agencies, but some non-independent regulatory agencies do have statutory specific requirements. So it can be a little bit challenging to generalize given the diversity of requirements out there. Additional thoughts on it, recommendations that folks want to propose adding. And again, we're happy to take written additions to between now and the next meeting.
I could make one other comment, Connor, on
Please.
Recommendation, Kevin's third recommendation. I think that's the one that talks about 3, I think.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I kind of am sympathetic to the idea as a general principle, just because, oftentimes, as Stuart and I pointed out, with the discussion of alternatives, it becomes, maybe there's two others described, but they tend to be not regulating and regulating to such a stringent level that it's clear that the one they've chosen is the best. But the other side of that, it makes it a little bit challenging, is that we do have this observation, at least, that there are reasonable instances where considering, 3 alternatives may be too many, from the perspective of the type of rulemaking we're talking about. And, is it, again, raising these same things that we talked about before? Is it a novel issue? Is it, something that they haven't regulated in this space before? Or is it an area that they have lots and lots of experience? So I think, trying to nail down exactly how many alternatives they should think about in any given instance is a little bit difficult in that sense, if you have lots of variation. I mean, you could couch it to say, if those rules raise certain types of issues, then considering this number of alternatives makes sense, but maybe that's a way to caveat it. Anyway.
I share your sense, Chris. Well, I want to make sure we have time to get feedback for us on the preamble. We will, the entire recommendation will be open for discussion again next committee meeting, but let's move to the preamble, and we'll start with the first paragraph. And I do want to note, I made an omission. We have a discussion here about some statutes and legal requirements for considering alternatives. And I do want to recognize and commend to you Keith Holman's excellent memo on the legal requirements for early public input. I know that that's posted on the committee webpage, and it's a helpful piece of work in connection with this. So thank you, Keith, for providing that. And I'm sorry that I overlooked it earlier, but it has helped us inform the whole thing, and especially this first paragraph.
And I'll add in that Keith's memo also helped us in the development of the report. It was very useful.
Thank you,
Keith.
So with that, I will just open up the first paragraph, lines 1 through 8, for discussion.
A number of these statutes and executive orders, not all of them, but maybe the bulk of them, have different requirements for different intensities of rulemaking, if I can put it that way. And this recommendation seems to be written, the preamble seems to be written as if anytime you're making a rule, here's what you ought to do. And I wonder if it wouldn't be appropriate to recognize that there are rules and then there are rules, and that what this recommendation really is about is the kind of rule that would draw OIRA's attention, even if you were an independent regulatory commission and didn't have to pay attention to OIRA's attention.
2 thoughts on that, Peter. One is on line 4, we do have before proposing certain new rules, but would it help to
the requirement?
What? I'm sorry, what's that, Peter?
That's just about, oh, some things require this. That's all. It's not, it doesn't address the general tone of the recommendation, which is made, at least as I read it, the preamble, as I read the preamble is written as if it's really, this is a preamble for every rule you're going to adopt.
Would parentheticals in the footnotes, I'm sorry, very briefly, would parentheticals in the footnotes sort of outlining when these requirements apply help here? Like footnote 1, footnote 2, footnote 3, talking about significant rules for EO 12866, would that be helpful?
Or it often results in better informed decision-making and improved regulations on issues likely to draw significant public attention or likely to have a significant impact.
Draw significant public attention, maybe.
Fine.
Okay, let's leave that in for consideration. I'm sorry, Leanne, what were you going to say?
I was just going to point out that we tried to address this in lines 19 to 26 and point out a number of situations in which consideration of early input might not be relevant or helpful. So it's in the preamble, it's just a little bit further down. And I totally see Peter's point that maybe we want to move it up if we're concerned about the tone of the recommendation.
What do others think on this point?
I think saying it twice is a good idea. Once in the first paragraph and then again later.
Leanne, let's just flag to try to make the language sort of consistent between what's at line 6 potentially and then what's in that paragraph you just noted. Everybody, we could do that offline, of course, but just try to make sure the tone and the wording is consistent. We can look at that next meeting. Other comments on paragraph 1, including the definition of regulatory alternative and other thoughts.
It's Charlie Maresca. Having second thoughts about issues likely to draw significant public attention. We deal with regulations that never draw any public attention, but yet they have impact on small entities, and there is the statute that requires consideration of alternatives. So I'm just trying to figure out how the interplay of those 2 or 3 ideas actually works. I don't know that we want to make a recommendation that emphasizes issues likely to draw significant public attention because it doesn't serve my purposes. It would have that kind of a recommendation would have a non-supportive effect on what we do as far as alternatives are concerned.
Doesn't the statute require you to do it?
Yes.
I agree with Peter that you're dealing with 2 situations here. One where it's required, as in the Regulatory Flexibility Act, and
right.
Other situations where it's not required, but it's worthy of significant public attention, that both of these situations should result in early consideration of alternatives. And we're only talking in this new thing we just added here about the ones that are not required. So I don't see that we're saying anything negative about the Regulatory Flexibility Act here.
My sense is that recommendation 1, if you want to just scroll down really quickly and kind of really discusses this issue like in much greater depth. I don't know what you think, but it said we could refer to recommendation 1. Well, we want the preamble to read on its own, but recommendation 1 to me addresses the issue that we're discussing. And if there's a way to try to draw on that, I think that might put us in a better position.
So you're just asking procedurally, Connor, if that's a permissible thing to do?
Yeah, but it's also prudentially, it's not all that elegant, but what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, ideally if we could sort of express the concept, but if not, then yeah, I don't think that there's anything necessarily wrong with either saying, as addressed more fully below in the recommendations or in recommendation 1. I mean, to the extent we can say it without a cross-reference, that's probably better. But if we're struggling with that, then I don't think that that's entirely off the table. If that's the cleanest way to, make an associated point.
Okay, yeah, sorry for being unclear. What do you folks think if we try to think of a way to incorporate what's in recommendation 1 in a kind of useful shorthand, but if we can't, perhaps include a cross-reference, but take a stab at not doing it, but using recommendation 1 as the basis for the issue? What do folks think of that?
It's fine.
Okay with me. Sure.
All right, we'll see what we can do. All right, paragraph 2. Comments on paragraph 2.
Sorry, the footnotes are in the middle of it.
Oh, that's okay. This is largely kind of cross-referencing ACUS's work as well as the current work over at OMB. Steph, I don't know if you have any comments on this paragraph or others.
Yeah, apologies for the background noise. I thought it might be helpful to add after distributional impacts. Sometimes, rules have transfer impacts that we don't categorize in your A4 as benefits or costs, but that are still important to consider.
Sorry, Steph, could you repeat where you were suggesting putting that information?
Sure, it's right after the lines 13 and 14. Learn more about benefits, costs. I would just add distributional impacts before and technical feasibility.
Reactions?
This is a different reaction, but I wonder why the regulatory plan is not mentioned in relation to early input.
Where would you propose? Like in line 13?
Yeah. The early process of shaping a rule and including proposals for its regulatory plan.
Stuart and Chris, thoughts?
We did not think about the regulatory plan much, nor did it come up in any of our discussions. And so anything that we have sort of comes from outside of the research that we did. It just didn't come up. Chris, any other thoughts?
No, I mean, you've hit it, Stuart. Yeah, we didn't really talk about it, nor did it come up through the conversations that we had with agency personnel.
Although if OIRA is in fact administering the regulatory plan as it seems to want to be administered in section 4, including the independent regulatory commissions in this instance, the agency is in fact expected to do some of this work before it commits itself or announces its wish to undertake rulemaking on a given subject.
Other reactions on referencing regulatory plan here?
And this is Steph again. So, I mean, we do encourage agencies to address alternatives in their regulatory plan. Empirically speaking, I would say with mixed success, but, I think it's a good suggestion and I would have no concerns.
Peter, would you support broadening it to say something including rulemaking agenda, including proposals for its regulatory plan?
Sure.
Just I don't know what do folks think about its rulemaking, including its regulatory plan? What do folks think about sort of the broader idea of the agenda? Is that helpful or less helpful?
Just as a technical matter, in Executive Order 12866, the regulatory plan requirements are a little more extensive. So agencies are directed in section 4CB to summarize to the extent possible alternatives to be considered. That language is not present for agencies' regulatory agenda items. Some agencies do include that information in regulatory agenda entries, but I'm not sure. I would have to check whether or not that's visible to the public when the agendas are published. I know for regulatory plan entries, it is visible to the public.
Got it. That's interesting stuff. I was just thinking regulatory agenda in the broadest sense, not the unified regulatory agenda, but I see that the words overlap. What do folks think? What's the right way to phrase this? Stuart or Chris, do you have a suggestion on?
Yeah, I'm holding the screen up to read the material as we speak here.
Connor, I wonder if I noticed that we always presume here that these are rules that will go through notice and comment. Do we say that anywhere explicitly, that this is limited to rules that go through notice and comment?
Well, our charge from the council is the pre-NPRM stage. I don't think we say it anywhere explicitly, but we're sort of charged by the council with the pre-NPRM.
I didn't want to expand it. I wanted to make it clear in either the preamble or the recommendation that what we're talking about is only rules that are subject to notice and comment.
Following up on that, Bill, we don't want to discourage agencies from doing this. In fact, it's more important for agencies to do this if what they are doing is developing an interim final rule, which is going to appear before the stage of notice and comment, but that is without notice and comment and such.
Well, if the interim final rule is being done because either the agency doesn't think it's a matter of significant public concern, or because they think it's sort of an emergency, but they aren't going to use the emergency exception, I don't know if going through the jumping through the hoops that we are suggesting here would be appropriate either. But I'm at this point at least agnostic about that issue, other than I think we ought to be clear in the preamble and or the recommendation exactly what the scope of this is.
Lynn, if you want to go up, one potential place to consider would be in lines 6 through 8. So in the sentence, in this context, a regulatory alternative is used broadly and could mean, we could include a reference to the pre-NPRM stage in that sentence somewhere. I don't know what you think about that, Bill.
I'm not sure I'm seeing where you want to put this and exactly what it would say.
In this context, a regulatory alternative is used broadly and could mean, among other things, a different method of regulating, a different level of stringency, or not regulating at all in the context of pre-NPRM consideration. Or in the context of formulating an NPRM. We'd obviously spell it out.
Well, I mean, the only thing that I would note is, of course, NEPA isn't limited to rulemaking with respect to its requirements for considering alternatives. So I'm not sure if the first sentence and then this sentence sort of read together very well. In other words, I don't know if referring to it this way does the trick. But again, maybe this is something that the staff can think about before the next meeting as to how to make clear what it is we're trying to reach here and where to best say it and how to best say it, rather than trying to wordsmith it ourselves now.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, yes, NEPA cuts more broadly, but it does cover rules. But this project is, limited to pre-NPRM consideration. So there may be a better way to, maybe we want a separate sentence or something else, a better way to do it. But I'm not worried about the fact that NEPA applies more broadly than rules because we're just focused on the subset of rules within NEPA. I don't know, what do other folks think? Lan, do you have a reaction on including a definition here or somewhere?
Just off the top of my head, my instinct might be to include it in the sentence before, because I think we're really highlighting in that sentence what the purpose of this project is, which is where agencies aren't required to consider alternatives. So maybe even when agencies are not required to consider alternatives in a notice and comment rulemaking process or something in that spot might also be a helpful place to clarify.
As long as the wording is clear that it's sort of a scoping issue for the recommendation, then I don't have a strong view on where it goes, as long as it's clear that it's setting out the scope of what we're speaking to in this recommendation.
Yep.
So we can move that around, maybe even put a separate sentence or somewhere else.
Yeah.
Other reactions on this point?
Leave it to staff.
Steph Tatham writes below, prefers regulatory plan to regulatory agenda for, I guess, for the reason we discussed. So let's start with regulatory plan, noting that it's broader, and see how folks feel it reads next meeting.
Connor, is there a way to word that to get at, I think you had suggested you wanted to be a little bit, I guess, broader in the sense to, could you just say the agency's specific regulatory agenda or something along those lines to just make it, basically kind of more suggestive that it's about, the scope of what the agency is considering or something of that nature.
Yeah, I was thinking including the agency's regulatory priorities to avoid, or rulemaking, maybe it's rulemaking priorities, because Steph Tatham points out that regulatory agenda is, a defined term in this context. So rulemaking priorities might get at that. I don't know what Peter thinks or what others think.
Connor, Christopher, I have a suggestion here. This is Steph. I'm open to having this be broader and include the regulatory agenda, but my recommendation would be, because proposals for the regulatory plan are a specific thing. Just a minute, babe. Sorry, my toddler's home today. But if we said including seeking input while the agency is still in the early process of shaping a rule and developing its regulatory agenda, then comma, and we kept including proposals for its regulatory plan, I think that would have both the broad and the specific.
Excellent.
That works for me. I don't know what others think.
Fine.
Yeah, that looks good.
Well, I think that's good. Other comments on paragraph 2, which is currently lines 10 through 20. Moving down to the next paragraph, I guess paragraph 3, lines 21 through 28. This is the paragraph we discussed earlier about costs of going through some of this alternative gathering, as well as the appropriateness of different contexts.
Connor, is there any risk that the last sentence in the paragraph will invite people away from the issue about distributory effects, distribution effects that Steph helpfully suggested we insert earlier on?
The idea being that the agencies might neglect those who have a harder time participating because they want to maximize or to be cost effective. Is that the idea?
Ensure that they are soliciting input in a way that is cost effective.
Yeah.
But not to ensure that they are soliciting input in a way that is distributionally just.
You mean with respect to like whose input is sought? Is that what you mean?
Sorry, I'm kind of lawnmower or something outside. I'll try and mute it.
So Peter, I lost you. I couldn't hear the last thing there. I'm sorry.
I think he said there's a lawnmower outside and he's going to close his window.
Oh, okay. Couldn't tell from that background. You there, Peter?
Peter, I think you muted yourself when you got up.
Just building on what Steph has suggested about distributional effects, I think one should be conscious throughout this recommendation not to address alternatives as if the alternatives were just to be measured in economic terms. And
yeah,
cost effective has that suggestion to it.
I don't view this as the nature of the substance of the alternatives. I just view this as the process itself.
Distributionally just belongs in there even so. Cost effective and distributionally just, right? But no problem.
do you think of the nature of whose opinion being solicited is distributional? I don't know.
Should be.
What do others think?
This is Steph. I agree with Peter's suggestion. Maybe cost effective and equitable.
Yeah, or
noting there could be
inclusive,
some tension. Yeah, or inclusive.
I like that. Peter, what do you think of that?
That's fine.
Okay. Equitable and inclusive?
I take it equitable reaches inclusive.
Okay. Other reactions to paragraph 3, lines 28 through 20, sorry, 21 through 28. Okay, moving on to the last paragraph of the preamble. And this is a subject that we discuss also in the recommendation, but this is the idea about documenting outreach and transparency. And here we have the confidentiality and privacy concerns. So we want, whatever we do, we want to track that throughout, I think. We can do that later. I kind of like that formulation, but what do folks think about this paragraph? Any comments? Okay, so go ahead, Peter.
Connor,
yes.
I didn't realize it was muted. I dislike the avoids comments that suggest alternatives the agency has already analyzed, because it points in just that direction that Don Elliott wrote about. Let's not have comments on these alternatives in the notice and comment process, which submerges the notice and comment process and turns it into kabuki theater. I would just leave that phrase out.
To capture the point, would you say something like improves the quality of potentially improves the quality of public comment on alternatives, potentially improves the comment?
Or just potentially involve the full picture of the agency's work, potentially involving the utility of public comment. That would be fine.
That seems fine to me. Utility of public comment.
Utility, you said?
What do folks think? A public comment, perhaps. Reactions? So let's see, the time is 3:35. I want to just, any ACUS members have additional comments about our discussion today?
Connor, could I just make one more point on this paragraph?
Yes.
I noticed that the very last clause on lines 33 and 34 makes it easier for a court to review the agency's decision-making process. That caught my eye in part because the excellent report indicated that one of the reasons agencies don't always discuss alternatives in their rulemaking is fear of litigation. And so I was wondering if there's maybe, and this could certainly go to the Committee on Style, a more positive construction that could be used here, perhaps to make it easier for the agency to defend its decision-making process, or to show a thoughtful decision-making process. The point isn't that courts should the point is that it supports the agency in litigation, not that it invites litigation, if that makes sense.
What would you think about referring to the agency's record, rulemaking record, something like expands the rulemaking record or something like that? Or
makes more robust the rulemaking record, or
supplements the rulemaking record, or
provides evidence of the agency's serious consideration of the issues.
There you go.
I like that better. What do other folks think, though? Additional thoughts from any ACUS members? On anything from today, and again, we'll take offline. Okay, so it's, what is it, almost 3 40. So let's say I would grant consent for the non-ACUS members. We could speak for about 10 or 15 minutes. We do not want to go past 4 because I know people have commitments. But I would, if others agree, if we have unanimous agreement, we can open the floor to the non-ACUS members. But I will provide the opportunity for the ACUS folks to object if they're so inclined.
This is not an objection, but I hope that anyone who does speak will fully identify their affiliations.
I agree with that. If there are additional rules. Okay, without objection, I see the first hand up is Kevin Bromberg. So Kevin, I'll recognize you for short comment.
Thanks, Connor, and greetings to my many colleagues. For those who haven't read my wonderfully written and well-supported comments, I wanted to defend some version of some combination of 1, 2, and 4, which might make people feel better because
Connor, can I just jump in here? And Kevin, could you just
I forgot.
Could we just observe Peter's request and identify yourself and your affiliation?
Sorry.
Thank you, Matt.
I was thinking of the people who knew me. Yes, thank you, Matt. I was 40 years working at the U.S. Small Business Administration, Office of Advocacy, and retired last year. So these ideas are a product of 20 years of SBREFA experience, which Professor Shapiro has written now extensively upon, and I'm drawing upon. Thanks, Matt, for reminding me of that. So what I'm struck by is people objected to the what sounded too prescriptive versions of early input requirements. My whole take on what needed to be done here, which was not in these recommendations, was we didn't tell anybody how to do early input. We said we're going to study it. Well, we've spent 20, 30 years studying it, and a lot of research is already ongoing. And Professor Shapiro has written about it. And here's the capsule sum of my SBREFA experience. I found that when we provided the appropriate information to the in our case small business representatives, we got very good advice that the agency always used. Didn't have to agree with it, but always used. It was a very small investment in time for the agency, and as the report says, everybody found it valuable. They questioned, its cost. So this would be a recommendation only applicable to significant or very significant rules. So what I'm really posing to the conference is, if you want people to do early input, don't you have some idea of how you would structure the early input so that it would be valuable? And so I was attempting to put out something that was not prescriptive. White papers, you can fill anything you wanted in a white paper. So I gave some very tentative, very broad schemes coming out of BCA literature. So all I was suggesting was that if you wanted to do it in an informed way, and this is what we learned over 20 years, how to do this, we found out that we should have some description of the regulatory alternatives, some back of the envelope calculations about costs and benefits, quantitative or qualitative, and some identification of the key issues and the purposes of the rule. It's hard for me to imagine that if you wanted to do early input and have it make sense, that you A, wouldn't have a structure, and B, how would you not structure it in those ways? So I was trying to be very general, and I am drawing on the ADP process of EPA, and they learned how to do this over decades. So this is not written on the whole cloth. And the recommendation for the 2 white papers was you send to the small entity reps, in this case, your first version of a paper. They would tear it to shreds the first time, and you do a second paper, and you're much better off. This was a very small investment in time. It's basically 30 to 60-day period for the 2 iterations, and then you're done. And so all I'm trying to suggest here is we already know something about the elements of what informed early input would do. I've seen a lot of very bad early input. The purpose of ACUS is to provide people with good advice that was general enough that we'd be ready today. By the way, the corollary to this is you could say, okay, Kevin's got great ideas, sounds good on paper. Let's really research this, get more details on how it really worked in Sabrifa, elsewhere. You could do that. That actually would be a very wise decision. But I didn't want to leave it there and not explain to people that, a white paper has no prescriptive elements to it. It could be any length and any amount of content, but it does have a central structure of purposes, costs and benefits, and some way. And we observed that EPA was always benefited by having that. And by the way, of course, you would discuss that in the preamble and or RA,
Okay.
your choice.
Thank you, Kevin.
End
Thank
of
you.
polemic.
Okay, thank you. I open up to other folks who would like to speak. Okay, hearing none, we will circulate a draft. Can somebody remind me, Leanne, when is the next meeting? Is it next week or the week after?
It's actually April 27th, so we have
Oh,
a
it's longer.
pretty decent sized gap. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, we'll get it circulated with a good amount of lead time. Please, again, send feedback to Leanne, me, Chris, and Stuart, including specific language is always the most appreciated. Matt, Reeve, Leanne, any other closing comments, requests?
No, just to thank you. I thought that was an extraordinarily helpful and good meeting and exceeded my expectations at least. Thank you, Connor, and thanks to all the committee members and the public participants. And thank you also to Keith, whose memo that I neglected to mention at the outset, which was very helpful. And thanks for our comments. Thanks for the comments from our public commenters.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Connor, you've asked me to draft some things. Would you or Lee send me the paper as it now is?
Leanne will do that. Yep.
Yeah, I'll take care of that.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.